And so, frankly, I would first say if you're trying to measure individual developer productivity at that level, I think you need to ask some tough questions about, is that really effective, and is that really the culture you want to drive?
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the MyDevSecOps community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out mydevsecops.io to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk is a dev-first security company helping companies fix vulnerabilities in open source components and containers without slowing down development. To learn more, visit snyk.io. On today's episode, Guy Pajani, president and co-founder of Snyk, talks to Steve White. Steve is a field CISO for Pivotal, where he gets to regularly exercise his passion for working at the intersection of application security, development, infrastructure, and operations. He spends his time helping organizations envision and implement new ways of integrating security into their software development, deployment, and operations lifecycle. Most recently, his focus has been on cybersecurity, helping build a cybersecurity consulting practice for Microsoft, and then leading security teams for companies such as Amazon, Sonos, and CenturyLink. Prior to joining Pivotal, Steve was the Chief Security Officer at ForgeRock.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Today, we're going to get a bit of a broader market perspective here from someone who works with a lot of security and technology leaders across the enterprise, and that is Steve White, who is a field CISO at VMware. Steve, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Guy. Thanks for having me.
So, Steve, we're going to go broad in a sec, but before we do that, tell us a little bit about sort of yourself and kind of your path to where you are today.
Absolutely. Well, first thing I'll say about my path was, like many, it was accidental in a lot of cases. I started my career really honestly back before security was even a profession, right? The early security practitioners, we were sysadmins and network admins and the people running the systems. And we didn't have things like firewalls, and we didn't have things like anti-malware software. And we kind of invented this space trying to protect our systems. The first firewall I ever used was a bit of software running on a Sun server. So, fast forward a career from there, I learned to really appreciate all facets of security during those early years, moved into some application development roles, ultimately a senior tech leader role, and then moved into security full time, trying to help build up a security consulting practice for Microsoft. And then from there have held a number of internal security roles at places like Amazon, CenturyLink Cloud, and Sonos, and then was the chief security officer at ForgeRock, and now am a field CISO at Pivotal, VMware, and spend my time really focusing on how can I best help organizations think through and strategize around this transformation into cloud native, right? How do we take what had become traditional enterprise security, mechanisms and methods, and how do these change based on sort of this move to interesting things like containers and microservices and agile development? So that's what I spend my time thinking about and looking at today.
Who do you typically work with? So like who's the sort of the peer in the companies you work with, or maybe the profile of the companies?
Tends to be the larger global enterprises. So those companies who are primarily going through digital transformations, right? Companies who are writing a lot of their own custom code that they derive significant business value from, and they're working to transform how they write that code, right? From sort of the traditional monolithic waterfall method into now, right, the microservice-oriented, cloud-native 12-factor apps, right? So as those companies who are making that transformation because it brings business value to them, I'm working primarily with their security leadership and security engineering and architecture organizations.
So within those organizations, within the enterprises that you work with, who's the sort of typical profile or sort of role of a person who works with you on sort of understanding the security concerns? Is it more sort of the the CTO kind of technology leader? Is more security mind role?
It's definitely the security organization. So, I have a number of peers that I work with who spend more time on the application development organization side of things. I focus almost exclusively on the security organization. So I spend my time talking primarily with CISOs, with director of information security, or sort of the leadership in security engineering, security architecture kinds of spaces. I spend much of my time there. Lately, have been doing some more detailed hands-on security workshops with, I would say, representatives sort of from every security discipline in the company. So security operations, incident response, architecture and engineering. We'll bring them all together in a room for a day and work through, some of the implications of what, cloud native security really means in each of those parts of the security team.
Thanks for the sort of the context.
Yep.
So I guess sort of dive right into it. Like you're helping these organizations kind of, keep security or level up even security as they do this sort of digital transformation and embrace all the sort of exciting new technologies. What do you see as kind of the pillars or the core tenets of change that they need to be doing?
Well, it starts with the first tenet of change in this space is that it's not just a technology change, although there is some technology shift that needs to happen. It's a culture and a perspective change that ultimately is the larger piece of what's to happen in information security, like it has happened in the rest of the business, right? So we liken it to, this change from security, historically perhaps was perceived as providing perhaps gates, right? And you had to pass through the security gate to get to production or something like that. And the phrase I like to use is we're moving from gates to guardrails, right? So security's, function in the enterprise moving forward should be to provide they're like the safety net, right? There's a top and bottom guardrail that would protect you from sort of exceeding, really bad parameters. But within those guardrails, development teams, operations teams have the flexibility to move around, to fluctuate, to flex, and to experiment, frankly, with what they need to do. And so that's one big topic. It's just that it's that cultural shift, that mindset. And, when you start to peel that back, how do you think about these culture changes? It really honestly comes down to, from my experience, it's the idea of pairing, right? The key differentiator, I believe, these days in helping security transform into this kind of, cloud native organization is pairing them with developers from application development teams and vice versa, right? Let's expand our knowledge, let's expand our relationships, and let's expand our understanding of how this work impacts the business. I think that's like one of the really key factors. Now, there's a whole lot of technology that comes with that culture change too, but without the culture and perspective change, all the technology in the world isn't going to make a difference.
I've got like a whole like a series of questions now to just ask based on that that answer. So I'll start with that pairing comment. So like pairing is a bit of a loaded term, right? In the world of development, to talk about sort of extreme programming and pairing. When you talk about pairing developers and security people, are you literally talking about like two people watching the same screen kind of working together, or pairing
in an ideal world? Yeah, both. In an ideal world, so I am ingrained in the Pivotal culture. If any of you are familiar with Pivotal and what we created, right? Pivotal was very big on extreme programming and pair programming and test-driven development and all of the things that go with that. And I'm here because I believe pretty strongly in the value of those things. But not every enterprise is there, right? Not every application development organization, for example, sees paired programming the same way. So when I speak of pairing, I would love to see it be in the true sense of paired programming, where two heads sitting in front of one screen working on solving one problem together. And if one of those folks is a security engineer and one of them is a feature developer, they're both learning a lot, right, and adding a good chunk to the conversation. That doesn't necessarily work for every organization. So if you're not an organization where pairing is a particular practice that you use, then you go along the line of things like rotations, right? So take a security engineer out of security, put them in a feature development team for 90 days, right? Let them be a part of that team and participate in at whatever level they can and write code, right, at whatever level they can, and vice versa, right? Take a feature developer, embed them in the security organization for 90 days or 180 days, whatever you can do. So pairing can look like a lot of different things depending on what's appropriate to that enterprise, but it's pairing these folks who would not necessarily have been working together side by side, give them common shared goals and outcomes for a period of time, and let them learn from each other, right? It's that connectedness and that relationship, I think, is really important part of that.
I love the analogy to sort of extreme programming pairing. So like, I think organizational pairing, that makes a lot of sense to me as well.
Yep.
That, that visual of sort of working together is a beautiful one for the cases where that works.
It is.
So unpacking another piece that you said over there was this notion of guardrails. So I'm a firm believer, right? Guardrails, you basically want to say, basically paint out the extremes, thou shalt not pass, kind of between, past those elements.
That's right.
How do you help developers, though, make the right decisions in between the guardrails? Like, there's still a range of security decisions they can make.
That's right. Yeah, so this is another key thing, I think, that's enabled by this idea of cross-team sharing that I described, and that's in the modern sort of cloud-native security organization. Actually, a good chunk of time needs to be spent writing code that the rest of the organization can adopt. And whether those tools be things like, whether those are code blocks that enforce identity, authentication, authorization in a particular way for the languages used by your company, right? So that's one idea. There's a lot of other ways that security teams can write code, and it's typically in the realm of either reusable objects that developers can embed in their project and use, or it's in the realm of tools that help them integrate their methods and their procedures better with the tools that exist in the rest of the organization. We're having security focus on writing code in those spaces, I think, pays big dividends in that question. How do you help developers navigate the guardrails? You give them tools to do that. And the security organization should spend a good chunk of its time creating those tools and listening to their developers and making them better so those tools better fit how their developers do their work.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess when you work with secure organizations that might not have had that approach before they started, I imagine like many times they're not necessarily like the skills in the team don't necessarily lend themselves to doing such sort of, coding activities. How do you see, or maybe how do you guide organizations to sort of navigate that expansion or transition of skills?
Right.
And actually, if you have any opinions on like which skills can they actually invest less in, as we move to this world?
Yeah, let me start with the first part of that question. Absolutely have thoughts on that. Everything comes back to Agile. It's about incremental change. So the first thing I would speak to organizations making that transition is don't try to do the whole thing at once, right? Pick a particular area where you can make an impact. And you don't want it to be a low, quiet, non-visible area. It's like some people trying to do incremental change will pick this little quiet, part of the business that doesn't have a lot of visibility and impact. That's actually not the right way. The right way is to pick a small piece of what you do that has lots of visibility, lots of impact, and make a change there, right? So pick a marquee application, right, that's being developed and have one of your, security engineers working with that team or vice versa. Pick a particular problem area. So if you do a survey across your development organizations, if there's a particular problem, let's say with how SQL authentication has happened, right, with backend databases, that's visible and it often will cause security vulnerability alarms. So pick that one problem and now go and write some code to solve for that problem. If you don't have any folks in the security organization who are developers, borrow some, right? This is back to that pairing idea. Bring a couple in from the application development organization and have them help you write tools that they and their peers would want to use, right? But do it in a paired programming model. So even if you're not big on paired programming, in this scenario, bring one of your security engineers who's eager to learn new things, pair them with that developer in whatever way works in your organization, let them learn from that effort. So that's like how an organization can get started like right away. The other thing I would be doing for any enterprise organization doing security today is I'd be hiring right, for these skill sets. So as you're hiring new people into the organization, this is a place you can hire junior people into security, right? Maybe they don't know a lot about security, but they're pretty good, they've got some good development skills behind them. You can hire them into the organization, because most enterprise size security organizations regularly have openings that they're trying to fill. So rethink about some of those open positions, repurpose one or two of them, bring in a developer heavy or even a developer with little security experience, and then train them over time. The last piece of that I would say is training, right? So find individuals inside your security organization who raise their hand and say, hey, I want to learn this new thing, right? I want to be part of this change, and give them some training, right? You can invest in your people, and sending a security engineer to training to learn some development skills, that creates loyalty, it creates energy, it creates enthusiasm, right? It creates a whole lot of positive side effects that they can then bring to the organization. So those are like three straightforward things you can do. There's a variety of others.
Yeah, no, but those are great advice, both on kind of where you focus, which is, pick one that matters, not that's
right.
kind of hidden, that you care about, the sort of the transitional sort of change and the pairing. Once again, I think that's definitely kind of a strong theme and a powerful one, and kind of the human aspect of sort of So all sound like really good suggestions. Let's maybe transition. We're going to make a bit of a transition towards the world of dev, right? So, this is security, and they're building it, and they're building those kind of skills and tools or different approaches. How do you then advise that they engage with dev? I mean, how do you see the collaboration happening in terms of process and steps?
Right. There's a lot of different ways you get after that. I'm a big fan. I've seen a lot of success in what I have historically called sort of the security champions program, right? And that, the security champions tend to be, it's like a way you help the development teams get invested and take ownership of security for their code, right? The stuff that they're creating. And it's difficult to try to train everyone all the time and get them really enthusiastic about security things, right? I think that's not effective for most organizations, right? It's to try to get an entire development team jazzed about security, And so it's like pick same ideas like I have on the security side is on the developer side. Pick one person who's part of the team who has some enthusiasm for security, who, has some understanding or some background in why it's important, and invest in them, right? Give them some additional training, delegate to them some responsibility, right? That perhaps the security team might have held within their arms previously, right? Find a security champion and say, hey, we're going to invest some training and we're going to invest in some responsibility, right? That now because you're on the team, we're going to take off the reins some, right? We're going to take off some controls, loosen the guardrails, and give there more flexibility within this operating framework because you now have, right, a security voice embedded within the team. That person, because they are a day-to-day functioning member of the team, can find incremental ways, right, to help the team make small changes or, do small things a little better. And so I'm a big fan of kind of that sort of natural growth of security awareness inside of a team. The second part of that, right, is frankly, it's to move security tooling and security validation earlier in their process, right? We all like to talk about this shift left thing, right, with security. Although if you ever look at the DevOps lifecycle, it's a continuous loop. So how you shift left in a loop, is beyond me, but nonetheless, we still use that terminology. For me, it's simply, where do I provide security feedback to developers in a more timely fashion and in a way that's consistent with the way they work, right? That's always been one of the challenges is in security, like we'll run our SAST and our DAST tools somewhere down in the pipeline, and all we do is send them a report of 1,000 vulnerabilities in their code and we're done, right? And that's just not how you build those bridges, right? It's not how you build that awareness. And so finding ways to give those developers actionable real-time feedback as close to the time they write the code as possible, and then making sure that when you're providing security-related, findings or feedback or what have you, that it really actually truly is actionable. It's not fanciful. It's not, we have this tendency in security to sort of take the high ground, right? It's like all the vulnerabilities have to be gone. There can't be a single line of, misplaced code. And that's not really, where we need to be, right? One of the advice I've heard from others who I respect in the space is, pick a particular security problem you're going to focus on, say, for a month, and have all the development teams focus on that one class of vulnerability, like SQL injection. We like to pick on that because that's a pretty bad one. It's like all the teams we're going to focus on SQL injection this month, and so we're going to turn the knob up, right? We're going to turn the noise level up on SQL injection this month. And we're going to do everything we can. And then next month, we'll look at something else. But engage the teams in that conversation about, what it should be, how they should receive the feedback, what's best for them. If you actually engage the developers in that conversation, I think you'll ultimately get better results. So those are some of the keys.
Yeah, no, all great advice. No, I very much resonate to sort of the whole shift left. I like to say it's not shift left; it's top to bottom. It's the
right.
sort of like go to sort of the from central governance to central controls, to sort of bottom up and empower teams. A small question about the practicality of the Security Champions program. I mean, lots of good things to say about it. One of the pushbacks is that organizations don't always acknowledge that this developer, the person in the development team who's now been sort of added, some form of authority, might have a different job. I mean, how do you recommend, or sort of how do you see work best for organizations that do that security champion in terms of the role description for the security champion? Is it a percentage less work that they do on the product side? I mean, how does it relate to their day job?
Yeah, well, that's a really interesting question, and I think is also in some ways a cultural question, right? So if you are trying to measure output of individual developers down to the level where if they spent 2 hours on security champion work, it would show up in some developer productivity metric, I think you need to question the cultural approach to that. Because frankly, output of development organizations should be focused minimally on the team output, right? There is very little external measure, I would argue, that is effective at measuring explicit individual developer productivity, and especially in organizations where you're pairing, right? Because now it's like, well, am I measuring the pair? And so frankly, I would first say if you're trying to measure individual developer productivity at that level, I think you need to ask some tough questions about, is that really effective, and is that really the culture you want to drive? And so if you take that up a level and you're measuring productivity and impact, it's really more about impact and feature flow and, team metrics, right? Are they getting impactful things to the customers? Do the customers love what they deliver? Do they deliver frequently? Those kinds of metrics are what's important. I would argue that you're not going to see a big change in that by having one person spend some time on security champion types of duties. The other thing is that once trained, so there is a training period, and during that period, there may be some reduction in flow. But the responsibilities of a security champion are really just to speak up during planning, right? Or speak up during design sessions, to ask the questions of the team. Did you think about this? Or did we include this? Or is this something that really should go through a deeper security review? It doesn't take a lot of work, right? It's not a big investment in time. It's like a focus versus, amount of effort kind of thing. So it shouldn't take a lot of time.
That's a great answer. So it kind of leads me well to sort of another question I wanted to ask, which is, like this measure, that team is also supposed to produce secure software, and presumably whatever load got, provided by this sort of, individual that might be helping also is taking some off, or like helping others do their work more effectively. How do you see, so we're going to kind of take that last step, into the world of dev and ask some questions there. So how do you see, again, kind of best practices around helping the dev side of the fence appreciate security work, sort of time spent, effort made in security, in terms of like measurement, mandate. I mean, like these are enterprises, so not often, like when you're sort of a small organization, sometimes, osmosis and values and change suffice. Tends to be that in the enterprise, you need something a little bit more structured. What works best?
First off, I don't think that I've seen a one-size-fits-all for every enterprise, because honestly, it is a very cultural perspective. And even within enterprises, right, there's a big variety in culture. But I will say that I think the most effective thing I have seen in terms of helping the developers understand the impacts, right, and the importance of security is frankly the value of something like a pen test, right? But a pen test specific to the code they're writing, right? Because really a penetration test or testing like that comes from the attacker mindset. So what we're really trying to do in this scenario is to help the developers really adopt an attacker mindset. It's like, if I was attacking this code, number one, why would I? So give them some really good illustration. Like, if I break this, right, then I got to this, and now all of a sudden, I copied, 1,000 credit card numbers or healthcare or health record, pieces of information. Nothing, I think, reinforces that message better than that kind of effort. And that's true from the executive tier on down, right? Like a good penetration test that demonstrates a chain of vulnerabilities carries powerful illustrations.
It's like a sobering moment to
it does, and those things don't have to be external. So the other really interesting thing here is, if you're building this kind of culture, is you can actually build, a pen testing or a vulnerability assessing kind of mindset even within the application development organization, right? There's nothing that says that you might not take a sprint and attack your own code or attack your neighbor's code, right? And have them attack yours. Like, actually spend some time having folks go out and actually purposefully attempt to exploit their own code or the other team's code. It really reinforces, these things of thinking like an attacker, understanding how these things can chain together, and more importantly, leading back to what's really important to the business. So every developer I've ever worked with, right, they care about the business. They care about what's important to the business. They care about their code doing good things for the business. And so if you can always tie these back to what data is being protected, how their code fits into that story, and if you can make this connection very visceral, right, through pen testing and those kinds of things, I find that carries a lot of emotional value for the organizations.
I love that as well. It's like security, to an extent, sobering as well as fun, so security and risk is sometimes boring, but sort of.
I will tell people the most fun I ever had in security is red teaming, right? That was my most fun assignment ever in security, was being a red teamer or a black hat hacker.
One more question on the dev side. We're going to kind of level up a little bit.
Okay.
So, like, what you suggested right now is good for like getting them engaged, kind of getting them alive. Mm-hmm. How do you measure if they're doing a good job? I guess that's not just a developer's job, it's sort of security as a whole, but how do you know that it's working?
There are, I think, various ways to answer that question, but ultimately it comes down to me. Number one, are the risk metrics that you use as an enterprise, are they improving, right? So every enterprise has a set of risk metrics that they're tracking as it relates to all parts of the organization. And so the way to look at this from the app developer side is a set of those metrics that apply to the custom developed applications and the platforms on which they're running, right? And so one way of looking at this is simply talking about, are those risk metrics going down or up? In whichever way they're going, having a pretty open, honest conversation about what it is that's driving those metrics down or up. So that's one way. Another way to look at that would be I'm thinking of the relational metrics of it, right? So I'm big on actually having people who are working together, basically, kind of rating that experience, right? Or rating their collective collaboration. I'm looking for a word here, but it's like, how do I rate the effectiveness of my collaboration? That's ultimately what I'm after, right?
Almost like I think a sentiment element, like an NPS.
It's almost like an NPS, right? It's like a net promoter score, but it's internal. And so I would say you're seeing success in this scenario if you ask the app development organization, hey, how good of a partner is security? How easy is it to follow the guardrails? What roadblocks are you seeing in the security processes? And vice versa. You marry that up with similar questions from the security organization. Hey, how receptive do you find the app development teams? How collaborative is your relationship with them? How is the quality of the security in the custom developed applications going? like, ask these questions on both sides of that equation and focus on sort of the collaborative aspects of it more than the desk tools results going up or down in terms of vulnerability. Like, that's sort of an irrelevant metric to me, frankly. The number of vulnerabilities found in the source code, well, that can change just as I release a new tool into the environment and it skyrockets, right? So I think more about metrics that are more about collaboration, effectiveness, right? And then ultimately, like, what really is getting through, like, flow, right? How easy is the flow of applications through my security pipeline? And if it's easy to flow things through that are secure, great. And if it's not so easy to flow things through, even if they're secure, that's a red flag. And you can put metrics around that. You can measure it.
That's awesome. I definitely agree with kind of the sentiment of, like, it's people first and you do those versus just the metrics. But also, I haven't heard the sort of the survey idea, right? Or like this notion of ask people if they're collaborating well or not.
Right.
Before I kind of ask you for your sort of a bit of advice, just one overlaying question. So, like, you've been in security for a while and you've kind of seen a transition. You're also advising organizations specifically on that transition from, kind of pre and post kind of cloud native. You must have sort of developed more of some above and beyond the frameworks and all that, some hunch, some sort of sniff test about you're coming in, some properties that you're sort of seeing indicate, hey, this company is probably not or is very effective in security. What would you say are like the key highlights that really kind of trigger that alert? And how have that changed, between, kind of pre-cloud native, I guess, if we just arbitrarily slice the world, into like pre-cloud, post-cloud surroundings?
There's a lot of things I would say around that one. The first and most important I would go back to, is there a ongoing collaborative relationship between security and the application development teams? Is that relationship through tickets, service desk tickets, or is there an actual conversation happening on a regular basis? Like, that to me is the key indicator of a problem. If there is not an active, ongoing, like, daily or weekly conversation happening with active participation from security and app dev, then I think you need to dig deeper, because I think that's indicative of a challenge. If all communication is through service desk tickets, and those service desk tickets take 3 weeks to solve, and I mean, that's an indication, right, of an organization that may have some challenges in these kinds of digital transformations, right? And that's the point of it, right? These kinds of digital transformations are all about speed and agility. So you only get speed and agility if you're having active conversation versus trying to communicate sort of asynchronously. So that's number one to me. Number two comes down to that conversation about gates versus guardrails. If I look at an organization, I can pretty quickly determine, do the application development teams have some guardrails to function within, or do they have a bunch of gates they have to get through? Do they have to toss things over a silo wall to get security approvals? That's really another really big indicator, right? So those are two key ones. And then there's a whole ton of other ones, like how you're giving feedback on your security testing. How effective is your security testing? How well tuned is it? Are you providing developer feedback, at the keyboard entry layer, et cetera, et cetera. All of those are indicators, but the first two, right, always come back to that. How do they communicate?
Well,
how do they collaborate?
Would you say, like, are they just as important in the sort of the pre-cloud era as they are post? Is it like,
it's not about
even like, would you actually not even recommend them if you're sort of developing, for some reason,
right,
waterfall-ish applications?
Yeah, but I'll be careful. It's not so much about the word cloud, right? Because the word cloud can imply a move to public cloud. It can imply a lot of things. I use the term cloud native, which is, and we like to define 4 key things, right? Cloud native architecture and organizations are defined by microservices, right? They're writing all their apps as microservices. They're defined by automated CI/CD pipelines. They're doing SRE/DevOps kinds of things, right? And they're doing containers. Right? Those 4 things really make up a cloud native organization. And so I would say that traditional enterprises who are not defined by those 4 things, if they're not doing containers, if they're not doing microservices, they're not doing automated CI/CD, right, and they're not doing agile DevOps, the existing security mechanisms may work fine. right, for what they're trying to achieve, because the existing security mechanisms kind of grew up and were developed in that world, right? And they worked fine if you weren't trying to make those kinds of transformations. But those are the exact things that put the existing security measures in, a lot of pressure on them, right? When you're doing automated microservice, agile code development, trying to release features to production, say daily, right? The traditional code review, code testing, feedback cycle just doesn't work. And so, the short answer is it can work for a traditional enterprise to continue to do security the way they have done it. Most enterprises that are writing custom code, they don't have the luxury to stay there. They have to move into this cloud native world in order to compete, right? They'll become irrelevant if they don't, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, fully aligned. And you're right about this. I'm sometimes kind of lazy and say cloud when really kind of mean cloud native in that approach. But just to challenge you a bit more on that one, it's like, so for most enterprises, the switch to cloud native is hardly a one-time thing, right? Like they will have, right, for a long period of time, a portion of their assets, of kind of their technology stacks, be cloud native, and a portion remain in that traditional surroundings.
Correct.
Would you advocate using kind of those, if you will, kind of cloud native approaches to security across the board? Or would you actually kind of bifurcate the organization to say it's actually better for the sort of the traditional enterprise to sort of stay where it was?
Well, I would definitely suggest that it's best long-term to get the entire approach to security aligned with what I've described for cloud native. But if you have a bifurcated enterprise, and most enterprises are, as you said, we've got a lot of existing things that we have to keep up and running and maintain and those kinds of pieces. For most organizations, this is not an overnight transition on the security side either, right? So I would suggest that it's best for those organizations to start the transition now, get moving on transforming security just like you've gotten moving transforming application development, and have a plan and a strategy to make that transformation universal, right, across all of security. But you don't have to do it overnight, just like you don't have to transform all of the application development overnight, right? Make it sensible for your organization, make the pace of change something that the larger organization can consume, and do it in a planful way. So ultimate answer is this kind of transformation is great for all of security, but you don't have to artificially rush it to get there immediately for the whole organization. Do it incrementally, just like everything else.
Yeah. A nice kind of full circle as well to one of your first bits of advice. It's kind of pick the area you're going to start first. Cloud native is very clearly it. This has been sort of jam-packed with great advice, I think for the whole journey. I'm going to ask you for one more. As you know, I like to ask every guest that sort of comes on the show, if you had kind of one bit of advice or even like a pet peeve, something that kind of annoys you, you want people to stop doing or start doing, that you'd like to give to a team that is looking to kind of level up their security food, what would that be?
That would be focus on the actual threats to your organization, not the science lab projects that your neighbor has dreamed up, and keep your organization focused on combating those threats. That to me is like my number one advice to any security team. Focus on the real threats, not necessarily all of the imaginary ones.
Excellent. Spoken like a person who's had many a conversation with enterprise security teams with advanced persistent threat nightmares.
I've had lots of conversations with lots of really brilliant people. And to be clear, there are organizations under some very, very sophisticated threats, right? I have a pretty long military career in cyber, and there are lots of really interesting threats out there.
Yeah.
A lot of enterprises, out there today aren't going to see those threats. So.
Yeah. No, that's great advice. Steve, this has been a pleasure. Thanks a lot for coming on the show.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And thanks everybody for tuning in, and I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. For additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit mydevsecops.io. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, you can also find us on Twitter at @mydevsecops. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.